Mrs. Bogard ran another help-wanted ad in the newspaper. She only needed new stock every few months. She designed the ad to target the people most likely to fit the job description. She was not a woman who cared for wasting time. Wanted, flower shop assistant. Available to work irregular hours in irregular ways. Looking for a long-term position. No previous experience needed. Walk-ins welcome. Below it, she included a sketch of a single blood red rose. These types of ads did not bring her a vast selection, but it did bring her the right sort of people. Considering the odd hours, many were young school kids, the desperate, unknowing kind. Mrs. Bogard was mopping the back room of her flower shop when she heard the front bell ring. She dropped the mop in its bucket and wrung out the rusty water. She wiped her hands off on her apron and shuffled to the door. A girl stood in front of the flower case by the register, maybe 15 or 16 years old. Her eyes were huge, fawn-like. She held the newspaper in her hands and stared at the bouquets in wonder. Mrs. Bogard's face split in a hungry grin. Like 'em, she asked. The girl leaned so close to the case that her nose nearly touched the glass. I've never seen such red roses before. My signature, I call them blood reds. A crossbreed I have been cultivating for years. Mrs. Bogard stepped closer and stood beside her. Even the girl's perfume smelled of rose oil and lavender. Miss Bogard knew she would be perfect. What can I help you with today? The girl held up the newspaper. You said walk-ins were welcome, she said uncertainly. Mrs. Bogard nodded and clapped her hands, doing her best to mute her anticipation. If she bit down too soon, she would only scare the fish away. Like a good hunter, she waited. They are, she reassured her. You're here to interview. Splendid. Follow me, please. She tilted her head toward the back room. Don't you want to know my name? She said. Mrs. Bogard didn't even hesitate. Of course, she answered smoothly. She extended her palm. Forgive me, I am called Mrs. Bogard. Ellie, the girl answered, returning the handshake. Her interviewees always became alarmed if they saw the mess from the one before them. At least the ones who were good at connecting the dots did. Ellie looked around uncomfortably, her ears reddening. But she wasn't bold enough to turn away. That was a good sign. Mrs. Bogard let the door shut behind them. She nudged a tiny metal bar with her foot, locking the door from inside. Ellie didn't even notice. She just gaped around the room and asked, "Where's your greenhouse?" "If you're selected," Mrs. Bogard told her. With an impish smile, "I'll let you see it." A woman has to protect her trade secrets, you understand. Ellie raised her eyebrows. I wasn't aware florists had trade secrets. I'm one of the few, she said with I just don't see what that has to do with flowers. Flowers are surprisingly sensitive to different nutrient sources. I try to keep them as consistent as I can. Mrs. Picard stifled the impulse to chuckle at her. Do you have any questions for me? Yes, about everything. Don't worry about it, you're hired. What? I don't even know what the job is. That's quite alright. I do. Mrs. Picard pushed herself away from the table and gestured to the plastic curtain. Allow me to show you what I need you for. Ellie stood, clutching her tote bag and looking at the door like she was trying to think of the right way to excuse herself. So many people walked into that room when their every instinct told them not to, just to avoid offending her. The irony of that was one of Miss Picard's darkest pleasures in this job. Come along, she insisted. Ellie walked through the door to the greenhouse. I think I should go home, Ellie whispered. Mrs. Picard whispered back, You're right. A smile formed. You should have. Now Ellie's instincts won over. She tried to open the door, slamming her hands against it. Ellie spun and flew at her, but a single practice move, Mrs. Picard flicked out the switchblade and pressed it to Ellie's throat. Inside, she told her, You have a job to do. Ellie stumbled in, weeping now. The delicate skin of her throat pulsed against the tooth of the knife. Mrs. Picard reached out and lifted the heavy bar, fastening her greenhouse door shut. The flowers opened up their petals to greet her. Roses grew in thick, perfect clusters. The petals were an impossible red, blackened scarlet, color of old blood. It's a unique color, Mrs. Picard said. She plucked a roll of duct tape from a whisker basket on a shelf by the door. Ellie began to wail and scream. Please, darling, you'll upset the plants. Mrs. Picard winced. It's a soundproof room. You'll only make yourself die with a headache. Ellie's wet eyes scorned the room for an exit. Then she went even paler as she twisted, staring at the far corner. A heavy metal hook hung from the ceiling, a pair of handcuffs suspended from it. Below it sat a metal basin, stained copper. I won't tell anyone, Ellie insisted. Mrs. Picard's face split with something like pity. I'm sorry, they're hungry. She gestured around at her roses. You understand, there's always a higher sacrifice for art. She advanced on her, knife at her side. Please, Ellie sobbed, please. Mrs. Picard chuckled to herself, knowing the knife was only for show. It's not like she was a murderer. Don't worry, they always make it quick. Mrs. Picard handcuffed Ellie to the hook. If anyone had been in the flower shop, they would have heard a dull thud. They would have not heard Ellie whimpering as a cascade of vines slithered across the floor like snakes after their prey. They would not hear her muffled scream as the plants engulfed her. But Mrs. Picard heard it all. She stood with her roses and watched the blood waterfall. It was the scene.